these are two strategies of conceptualization. One is the classical one where by adding attributes you specify a concept further. The one that the example that I mentioned before, parliamentary democracy. I have democracy and I add the existence of accountability of the government to the parliament, which is specific for parliamentary democracy. There are other democracies. There may be direct democracy. There may be presidential democracy. I add an attribute. That's the classic strategy of forming typologies, of categorizing. The other one that I've just suggested is using so-called reduced subtypes. That is, we define a fuller concept, and the subtypes consist of the concept nearly fully present, except for one attribute that's missing. Yeah? And the example that's given here for this second strategy is again democracy. That's why I stick to this. Now, for this session, most of the examples are taken from democracy research. Yeah. The argument here is for democracy to be present. Yeah. This concept consists of three defining features, and this is effective political participation. That's A. Yeah. Component A. Limitation of state power. B. Through a constitution, for example, through a judicial system that enables you to lodge a trial if you feel yourself infringed in your constitutional rights. And C, for democracy, we need a certain degree, a minimum degree of equity, of social and economic equity. So this is a fuller concept of democracy that has been applied in research about of Latin American countries, where you have, of course, very high levels of inequality, traditionally, at least. And now, the empirical constellations of democracy that we find there, they meet this concept only partially. There may be participatory democracy where there are spaces for participation, but the other two elements, so the limitation of state power is largely absent, and also the social and economic rights are also in a very bad shape and do not enable all groups of society to participate in democracy. You might have liberal democracy, where there is a control and accountability of the state power, but the third element, socio-economic equity, is limited. And we might perhaps have something like a popular democracy, where there is effective participation and socio-economic rights, but there's no really controls there are no controls over the president, de facto, because the executive, the president, has somehow made sure that the parliament is fully under mostly his, but maybe her control, and the same holds for the judiciary system. These would be with so-called reduced subtypes, and there's one core component of this concept, and this is effective political participation. Yeah? This has to be present. Otherwise, we cannot talk about a democracy anymore. If this component is not present, yeah? If this attribute is missing, then the question arises: can we still talk about democracy? Okay. This is another example of a radial concept that underlies an expert survey on democracy and market economy I have been involved in. It's run by a Germany-based NGO, the Bertelsmann Foundation. It's called Transformation Index. It consists of regular biannual surveys of experts of country studies that are trying to evaluate the quality of democracy and economy and the political management of democratic and economic reforms. And the questions of the survey are based on another radial concept. I would just like to give it as an example, basically, because also it links to this discussion I showed you before. The key, it's called embedded democracy. The key is the electoral regime, so the effective exercise, the effective use of one's political participation rights. There are alternative political choices, and voters have the right to decide between these choices. That would be the electoral regime. electoral process. And there are other rights that are necessary to, that's how the concept is argued and constructed. These rights are seen as necessary to exercise, to make use of one's participation rights. And it's a broader array of political participation rights, such as media freedom. It's necessary, for example, to get information about the political alternatives suggested by the different competitors in order to make an informed and deliberate choice between them. This is the way it would be linked to the electoral regime. There is horizontal accountability. That means that what I said, that elected governments are subject to different forms of accountability to the parliament. They have to defend their policy choices and to explain their choices to the deputies of parliament, and their policy actions are subject to judicial review, whether they comply with the constitution. A third partial regime refers to the civil liberties. It's not sufficient so in order to be able to make an informed decision between different political choices, you not just need to have knowledge about these different alternatives, but you also need to be not afraid of being imprisoned after you have voted for the opposition party. For example, that's no discretionary imprisonment of persons. Certain judicial civil rights that are not directly related to the political participation process, but that one could argue are necessary in order for voters to really be able to decide freely. But there's there are no such forms of arbitrary state repression against voters. And finally, there's another partial regime that's called effective power to govern. That is, once the voters have taken their decision and have made their choice for a government, one has to make sure that this government indeed is able to govern, and that there are no enclaves, no authoritarian areas that are not subject to the constitution, and that such as, for example, think of the typical example that's usually raised here is the role of the military in Latin America. Traditionally, it has played a less important role in the post-Soviet world, but in Latin America, obviously, we know from the 80s that often the military staged coups against governments, so the question is to what extent such powers tend not to be ready to subject to themselves to the will of the elected democratic governments. So this is also seen as a part of democracy. And then from this, and then you have enabling conditions that are not part of the definition of democracy in this case, but are thought as necessary, such as the social economic conditions and the existence of a stable state framework. And from here, one could again define certain reduced subtypes, such as what I mentioned before. Illiberal democracy would be democracy where civil liberties are damaged or are not really enforced. Enclave democracy would be a democracy where the military is, for example, or maybe the state religion, the state church is not, and high church leaders are not subject to constitutional to the constitutional, not under the constitution, but see themselves and are somewhat outside the control of the constitution. So that's a concept I wanted to mention here that's used in research and in think tank work I have been involved with. Another example, that's a classic conceptualization, I would say, using these developing subtypes by adding attributes. It's a distinction between different types of authoritarian political regimes. Again, the generic category is regime, And then the first question is, do these regimes hold elections or not? Yeah? There are certain authoritarian monarchies that do not hold elections, in the Gulf region, for example, or maybe China, perhaps, where there are no explicit elections. There's a party congress, of course. So one could make a distinction between electoral authoritarian regimes and closed authoritarian regimes without elections, by adding one attribute. To a core of authoritarian exercise, a monopoly of political power, probably. It's not, the core is not made explicit here. Yeah? It's the attempt to develop a typology of different authoritarian regimes. Yeah? Then, going one level lower, add another attribute, ask whether these elections are contested or not. So, are opposition parties allowed to compete in elections? If this is not the case, then the authors of this typology suggest talking about so-called hegemonic authoritarian system. Of course, the paradigmatic cases are no longer correct nowadays. Neither Tunisia nor Uzbekistan. Since even in Turkmenistan we have opposition parties nowadays. Then, to what extent one can say that these elections meet minimum standards of freedom and fairness? If this is the case, then, of course, the question is to what extent one can then talk about an authoritarian regime anymore. If this is not the case, if the standards of the elections are clearly tilted in favor of incumbents and make sure that they always win, then the authors here suggest to describe this as a competitive authoritarian country. And then finally, within the set of democracies, one might distinguish between those that just fulfill the condition of elections, they are called electoral democracy, and those that fulfill also more ambitious conditions, they are called liberal democracy. That's an example of conceptualization by adding additional attributes. And forming a taxonomy in a way, in this case, because it's hierarchically structured, to distinguish between different groups of countries, concept formation.